infra to build great apps is definitely here. It can get better, but it's here. And I don't think infra is an excuse anymore to say like why you can't build a great crypto app. Two, I just think like the growth of tokenization in general is huge. Many banks are calling for like 10 trillion plus dollars in tokenized assets by 2030, right? That's like just around 5 years from now. That's huge, right? And if there's that many tokenized assets on chain, then you need something to do with those assets, right? Like they're going to be on chain, you might as well make them productive, right? You might as well lend them out, earn some interest. And I think Superform is the ideal platform for doing that.
Hey everybody, Tanner here with WAGMI Ventures. On today's episode, we have Alex Cort, co-founder at Superform. For anyone who's new, this is the WAGMI Ventures podcast, where we do snapshots with interesting builders, founders, and investors from across Web3. Check out wagmiventures.io to learn more about the syndicate behind the podcast. But for now, let's get into it with Alex at Superform. All right, what's up, everybody? This is Tanner with the WAGMI Ventures podcast. I'm here today with Alex Cort, co-founder at Superform. Alex, what's up, man? How are you doing?
Great, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on the show. So I'd love to start I'm always just curious, kind of crypto journey alongside professional journey, because sometimes they coincide and sometimes they don't. So maybe talk a little bit about how those journeys have worked out concurrently and how they've led up to the creation of Superform.
Yeah, absolutely. So my crypto journey started back in 2014. I had heard about Bitcoin in the past, but never really looked into it much until I had a friend attempt to mine some Bitcoin on his laptop for fun. And I was like, hey, I should check this out. I was kind of a young entrepreneurial high schooler, so I learned a bit more, ended up building a GPU rig, and I was mining script coins like Litecoin and Dogecoin. Also, like while learning about Bitcoin and crypto and getting, pretty like bought in on the promise of Bitcoin and decentralized finance. And that kind of let that interest die down a bit. And I rejoined in 2017 around ICO mania. I started trading a bunch of those tokens. I was a bit late to the Ethereum boat, but honestly, I got like super bought into the ecosystem, and like I was very captivated by a lot of what the ICOs were promising to solve. Obviously, like in hindsight, most of those did not really end up bearing much fruit. But, I think like the ideas around like decentralized identity and tracking the supply chain, ENS, like those are all super promising, and some of them are still around today. And I think that kind of helped me understand like, okay, you can actually build applications on the blockchain, right? It's not just a way to transfer money back and forth. And also that's around when I met one of my co-founders, Vikram. He was starting a small liquid fund, and I worked with him on that for a little while, and we became, very close friends. Again, that kind of died down, and I got back into it around summer of 2020 during DeFi summer, and that's the point where it finally stuck. I was hearing the hype around DeFi and decided to check out what this was. I remember using Uniswap for the first time and being like super blown away, because I had used like IDEX in the past, like 2018, and it's not like the best experience. And Uniswap was just like, miles and miles ahead of that. And I was just like blown away by the ease of use. And I fell down the rabbit holes, learning about DeFi. I was yield farming, near the end of the last cycle. There's a lot of alt L1s you could bridge to. So I was bridging to like Avalanche and Phantom and BSC. And obviously it was like a very scary experience bridging back then, but it kind of helped me get like a lay of the land. And at that point, I decided my next job is definitely going to be something in crypto. I was working in big tech as a product manager, but I just knew like what I did next had to be something in crypto. So, it was kind of my experience, throughout those years of exploring crypto, and then finally going like super deep in 2020. And then also just like seeing all the problems around DeFi that convinced me like I want to solve something in this space. And then that's kind of like the beginning of Superform. So I can happy to dive in.
Yeah, please do. I'd love, maybe for anyone who's not familiar, just kind of in its totality, what are you guys building at Superform? What are you guys seeking to enable?
Right. So we are a permissionless yield marketplace. I think the best analogy here is thinking of it like OpenSea, but for yield, right? So let's go back to 2017 or 2018, before ERC 721, before ERC 1155. Every single NFT project had its own website where you could only like buy and sell and view NFTs from that project, right? And the reason it was like that is because there was no standard, right? So you couldn't build any sort of application around those NFTs unless you had like a custom integration for each collection, each project, right? So when OpenSea came out and they built their marketplace around ERC 721, now you could like buy, sell, and trade and manage your NFTs all in one UI, right? And then NFTs kind of exploded from that point on. It took a few years with like the bear market, but in 2020 it was just huge. Uniswap, right? It's built around ERC20. Standardization was huge for enabling, all the exchanges we see today in DeFi. But unfortunately, like yield today is still where NFTs were back in 2018. So for a long time, there was no yield standard. And in 2022, we had the first yield standard proposed and approved. That's ERC 4626, which is, really the exact same thing as ERC 721, but for yield. So it's a standard interface where, you have a standard set of functions you can interact with, which makes it much, much easier for integrators to work with your vault if they know it's following a sort of standardized format. So Superform is built around ERC 4626. We let you list any vault that is compliant, totally permissionlessly. And if you are a user, you can access any of those vaults from our platform. So basically, we are cross-chain as well. So when you list it, it becomes instantly distributed to every chain that we're deployed on. Currently, that's 7 EVMs, but we can expand to more quite easily. And if you're a user, you can access any of those vaults using any assets in a single transaction from any chain. So we handle the bridging, swapping, and depositing on behalf of the user. So it's all abstracted away. And like if you want to get into yield and you're on one chain with one asset and the vault's on another chain and it's in a different asset, you don't have to go to a DEX and then a bridge and then the protocol's website to make a deposit, right? And then you're probably going to go and manage it on like Zapper or Zerion, right? So we're kind of bundling that entire experience into one application.
Super cool. Okay. Hey everybody, quick thing here. We're excited to announce WAGMI Advisory, your home for all things fundraising, hiring, and partnerships. This is all about supercharging your project with the WAGMI network consisting of over 20,000 executives, investors, and builders in crypto, all ready to come alongside your project to help it succeed. Get in touch at team@wagmiventures.io to learn more and figure out if WAGMI Advisory is the right fit for your project. Now, let's get back to the show. So, recurring question on this podcast is always around early challenges because they're just, I think they do shape sort of how things tend to go sometimes and sort of get into the DNA of things. And so I'm curious, whether technical or business, I'm curious what maybe one or two early challenges were for you guys at Superform and how your team thought about that.
Right, right. Yeah, I would say one of the biggest ones has definitely been getting people to adopt ERC 4626. We're one of the founding partners of the ERC 4626 Alliance, which is basically evangelization around the standard, trying to educate teams about it, provide developer resources for building 4626. The thing is, like, once a vault is audited and out there and it has TVL, it's really hard to convince a project to then go and like rewrite their vault in a different standard and migrate liquidity, especially if like they have users and it works and their users aren't obviously asking for, their yield to comply. So it's really hard to kind of motivate existing teams to go build 4626 if their vaults are already out there. But it definitely has been much easier for newer teams, right? Newer teams, it kind of speeds up development, adds an increased degree of safety because ERC 4626 has been looked at by many security researchers. There are very clear patterns for how to develop in 4626. So for newer teams, it's, I would say 4626 is definitely like the standard. Like most newer teams are using 4626 in one way or another. But it's been mainly, like those older teams that have been slower to adopt it. But now it's been over 2 years since the standard was finalized, and like we're really seeing a pretty large supply of DeFi on 4626. So right now, I think the total TVL on 4626 is about $5 billion, right? Which is relatively like modest slice of the entire pie, but like it's growing very fast, and I think we're finally seeing the efforts paying off from that like early evangelization. So that's one of the
Super
big
interesting.
challenges.
Yeah, super interesting. Okay. So sometimes challenges have kind of a negative valence or a negative connotation. I'm curious sometimes about the flip side too, just any positive tailwinds or any kind of early surprises that maybe have benefited the Superform team. I'm curious, if you had to pick maybe one or two early surprises and how they've shaped things, what would you go to?
Yeah, I would say like the enthusiasm that we've gotten from protocols building on 4626, right? Like we're a marketplace, so we're kind of building a product for both demand, that's people seeking yield, but also supply people who have vaults. And we've seen a lot of really positive responses on like the tools we're basically providing for those people creating yield, right? So for example, like teams used to have to debate about, which chains they're going to deploy on, and they'd have to add integrations so they could have like zaps from any tokens into their vaults. Well, now Superform, like you're getting instant omni-chain distribution, and because like we handle the bridging and swapping, like users can just use any token from any chain. Not only that, like we're also creating like a front end for these protocols. So just like on OpenSea, where you have like a collection page, we have a protocol page and a vault page where you can add metadata and we provide statistics. And all this is entirely no code, very little effort from the protocol themselves, and they get like additional distribution. They get like, alternate distribution. It's good to not have just a single front end, and a bunch of like really nice tools on top of that to make the user experience like very fluid and seamless. So in the future, we kind of see like the separation of the yield stack between like people creating like the underlying vault infrastructure. That's like Morpho, Yearn, Euler, and then people writing strategies. That's like Gauntlet or Stakehouse or B protocol. And then on top of that, you have people providing access and distribution. And that's where we see ourselves fitting in.
Very cool. Okay. So for you personally, like it's super tough in crypto, right? To look even a year down the road. I'm curious for you, like what gets you most excited as you think about the trajectory of what you're building at Superform, where things are going, how you guys are looking at your roadmap. What's got you most excited?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. One, I think the infra has really matured a lot. Like when we first started building Superform, it couldn't it could barely exist, right? Like the infra was so early, and it's gotten a lot better and a lot more reliable, and it's going to get even more better and even more reliable, and we're going to have even more options. And that really helps for building like apps that are kind of like on par with Web 2 in terms of like reliability and consistency and speed. So like the infra to build great apps is definitely here. It can get better, but it's here. And I don't think infra like is an excuse anymore to say like why you can't build a great crypto app. Two, I just think like the growth of tokenization in general is huge. Many banks are calling for like 10 trillion plus dollars in tokenized assets by 2030, right? That's like just around 5 years from now. That's huge, right? And if there's that many tokenized assets on chain, then you need something to do with those assets, right? Like they're going to be on chain, you might as well make them productive, right? You might as well lend them out, earn some interest. And I think Superform is the ideal platform for doing that, right? Because users are not going to be wanting to be chain hopping and swapping all the time and managing balances across multiple wallets or chains and always switching RPCs, right? So we strongly need a sort of like unification, especially as like all this becomes like a lot more modular and you have a lot more app chains and rollups and alt L1s. From a user perspective, like they're not going to want to go and visit millions of rollups, right? They want to just go to a few destinations where they can do everything.
Super interesting. Okay. So I'd love to take a step back here and ask some broader questions about the space. But before that, I just had kind of one more question that obviously not naming names here or anything, but I'm just curious always about failure modes across the space. Like, what do you see people getting wrong when they're building in crypto that others may find it valuable to learn from your perspective on?
That's a great question. I think definitely being very short-sighted is one of the key pitfalls. That can manifest in many ways, but like decentralizing too fast, having a poor token distribution model, generally just kind of not thinking about like long-term, how is what you're building sustainable, or how does it coexist with the rest of the ecosystem. We had a funny conversation when we started Superform a couple of years ago. It's like, hey, we're building a startup. Like before we did anything, like we just have to commit to each other as founders. Like, are we ready to do this? Are we ready to commit like minimum 5 years of our lives to this, and likely more if all goes well? And the funny thing about that, 5 years is that like you look 5 years back, like from 2020 to 2015, like, most of DeFi was built in 5 years, right? Like most of it was built in like a year and a half. So I think like people are just really kind of stuck in this sort of short time frame just because everything is so new. But it's like every cycle, like the biggest projects it seems are changing, right? And now you're starting to see a few kind of like long-term projects that are like really sticking around, like the Uniswaps and the Aves of the world. But like just as many are gone, right? And you would have thought they would have lasted a long time at the peak of the last bull market, and they're nowhere to be seen today. So I think having like a long-term mindset in what you're building is maybe the most important thing in crypto.
Love it. Super interesting. Okay. So let's take that step back and maybe just talk about the space in general here. And my first curiosity is, what do you think we're getting right as an industry here in 2024, if we can kind of call this an industry? And then where do you think we could be maybe doing things a little bit better?
Yeah. I'll start in the second question, like what we could be doing better. I think we need to do a better job of calling out like scammy behavior. For a long time, I think we just kind of tolerated it as like accepting it as part of the space. Like, I have no issues with people trading meme coins on Solana. Like, that's fine. But like when there's like coordinated like pumps and dumps and influencers are involved, like I feel like we really should be holding our community members to like a higher standard. Like, it is a very tight knit community and people know what's happening. And I think people just don't really want to call it out, or just because it can be like hard to prove things means like they don't want to touch the subject when like we know like there's definitely, you know, uncouth behavior happening in the background. And ultimately it's just mostly like retail players who get burned or people who don't have much information. And that's like really not fair. Like, I think, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people, like the core promise of crypto is like fairness and equity in finance. And I don't really feel like we live up to those values a lot of the times because people are really focused on just making money. It's greedy. It's a greedy space. I also think like there could be a bit more conviction from like the larger players, like VCs, in investing in things that are like innovative and hard to build, things that have like a high chance of failure. I keep seeing like VCs hitting like the infra button, right? Just investing in infra or a new chain because they know it's going to, print them like $1 billion. And I guess like from a financial point of view, like it makes sense. But I feel like there's other sectors within crypto which are struggling. Like people don't want to fund apps as much. People don't want to fund DeFi as much. When I feel like you need apps, good apps, great apps to get widespread adoption, right? And you need DeFi to provide services, that are trusted and safe in order to actually like unbank the world. So I think like more conviction in riskier ideas is another important thing. And then, yeah, again, just like calling out, scammy behavior. And I think like we had a nice cleansing of that at the end of the last cycle with a lot of like the big names like Doe and SBF kind of, yeah, obviously, I mean, they're in prison or jail,
Yeah.
but should have never have gotten to that point, right?
Right. Yeah, super great takes. I mean, it almost seems like it's kind of behind both of your critiques is like a little bit of some of the idealism too, of like, look, there kind of were some ideas that animated this space once upon a time, and it doesn't mean there aren't people still around that have those animating ideas. It just doesn't seem to
Right.
represent kind of what everyone's up to, all the various different parts of the space. And I kind of applaud that. I think that's really interesting. Okay, so another question I might have is if you could maybe give your most generalizable advice for founders within crypto specifically, especially given you kind of did come from big tech and you do kind of have a different perspective. You've seen the other side of the fence, right? I'm curious
Right.
if you could maybe go back, and one way of getting at this question is like, if you could go back to sort of your early days as a founder, what advice would you maybe want to impart to that version of Alex that, seasoned, wiser Alex might be able to impart?
Right. Yeah, I definitely got lucky with this, but choosing good co-founders, right? Like you can't fire a co-founder. I mean, technically you can, but that's like very messy. I would
Right.
not recommend that. So choosing like that core group of people that you're going to start this with is really, really important. And these have to be people that you can resolve issues with. They have to be people that you can reach consensus on tough decisions. People that you're confident are going to like work hard with you for the foreseeable future. Like really like as far as you can predict into your life, like they're going to be working with you. I also like would recommend like having a co-founder or like maybe even two. I have two. Like there are some things that I classify under like the founder duties bucket, and really only the founders can do those things. And if you can split that among like one other person or two other people, it's going to make your life like a lot easier, like a lot less stressful. And sometimes like you're just not in a place where you can make the best decision, and having like a second opinion is going to be huge. It's going to help you kind of not make irrational decisions or emotional decisions. So I think, if you go back, I wouldn't change anything. I got lucky, but like make sure like you're starting this with the right people.
Love it. Okay. So a couple last questions here for you, Alex. If I were to put to you the future of crypto is blank, how would you fill in that blank?
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'll take a line from the manifesto we recently published. I think the future of crypto is the enablement of a more open, coordinated, and equitable world. You know, that seems maybe pretty lofty, but it doesn't mean it's like totally world changing, totally revolutionary. It doesn't mean it's going to happen all at once. It just means it's going to be, a bit more fair. Most people around the world today, I don't think have access to good financial services, and when many or most of the things in your life in some way or another are depending upon money, it's a really difficult position to be in because there's not really a way to opt out until now, right? Like we've seen that with crypto, like you can start to opt out, and in the past it's like, you're born where you're born. That's the hand that you're dealt. You have access to what's available there. But, as crypto comes to maturity, the cards being dealt are fair because you have these other options. So, a few examples I can give is I've been, I've interviewed a lot of people, talked to a lot of people around the world, and, some of them are saying like they took out the loan for their house, on Aave, or, they're earning everything in crypto and keeping it in USDC because, their government is imposing capital controls, or they have money in the bank, but most of it's in crypto because they have no idea whether the government is going to allow them to even withdraw the next day. These are very much like non-American problems, right? Non-Western problems. This is like, pretty far removed from what when I experience on a day-to-day basis, but it's there and it's not really hard to find and talk to people who experience those things. So I think it's a gradual process. It's not going to happen all at once, but I feel very optimistic we're moving in that direction. And the proof is in the pudding. Like people are already using crypto to, have access to fair services. And I think it'll be a while before crypto and DeFi is like solving for my needs. I live in the US, and crypto for me is definitely more speculative because I already have access to great financial services. But I'd say for most people, like this truly can be like a life-changing technology.
Love it. Okay. So, Alex, one last question here for you. What is your team working on right now? And what's the best way for people to follow along in the journey?
Yeah, so right now we are still in early access while we wrap up a few features, but we should be in open access in the next month or so. So anyone will to log in with their wallet and use Superform. We have a few pretty cool features in the pipeline, some batched actions, letting you claim rewards, tokens, also support for more yields. We'll be expanding to new chains, really a bunch of stuff. We've built Superform in a super modular way so that like, we can add a lot to it and it can evolve and you don't have to wait all the way until like the V2 or V3 of a protocol for it to improve. And, ultimately we're an app, so you'll see a lot of new features in the app. But the best way to stay in touch is going to be on Twitter or through Discord. We're pretty active. You can ask us a question, we'll get back to you. And all of our announcements will be on Twitter. So if you're curious, I think the best way to follow us is just follow us there.
Perfect. Alex, thank you so much for coming on the show. I mean, fascinating work you guys are doing. Super cool how you think about things. I'm grateful for the time. So have a great rest of your week here and take care.
You as well. Thank you so much.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, go ahead and maybe give us a good 5-star rating and subscribe wherever you're getting your podcasts so you can get all the latest conversations with the most interesting crypto founders, investors, and builders from across the world. Thanks so much. Have a good one.